Welcome back, Bantwana Benkosi. This is indeed Power Talk. You are joining us here on Power 987. We turn to the book, The High Treason Club, the Boeremark Trial, the Boeremark on Trial by Karen Mitchell, who is also joining us on the line to discuss that notorious reactionary right-wing group. Many of you who have been around longer would remember that, but she's going to take us through those details, and I'm welcoming her now. But also we have the central detective that was at the center of making these arrests and cracking the case. Hello, Karen. Welcome to Power Talk.
Good morning, Mbuyiseni. How are you?
I'm very well. How do you do?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Good to be on Power FM again after many, many years.
I'm told you used to work here.
Indeed, about a decade ago. So it's been a while.
No, thanks very much for creating time. And Colonel Tolly, is that how I say the name?
That is correct. I would not expect you to pronounce his surname.
Yeah, I'm looking at it and I'm plotting. How do I say this? But help us, Colonel, help us.
That's a Dutch surname with a very Dutch accent.
Yeah.
Vreugdenburg.
Vreugdenburg.
Yes, we could call it Tolly, not Colonel Tolly, right through the interview.
Okay, Tolly. Okay, Karen, let's start with you. It seems to me it would be interesting that we start at the end. I see in the book you actually put the 23 people on page 326 and 325. But just as a point of departure, if you could just start at the end of what the Boeremark was about.
Okay, so this is going to take a few minutes.
Of course. Feel free.
So it took me about 10 years to write the book after doing the research, so it will take a minute to do it briefly. So it was 23 people who were accused. There was more than 42 charges against all of them. And one of the main charges was the plot to kill former President Nelson Mandela. They actually tried to assassinate him, which I'm sure we're going to get into deeper into the interview. But it was a group of right-wing extremist men who got together, and they had various plans. There were various stages in the planning as some of the groups got arrested during the police being on their trail. But that's the long and the short of it. They essentially wanted to overthrow the ANC government and reinstate a Boer Republic. They were heavily guided on the prophecies of Siener van Rensburg, who's a South African. You can kind of liken him to Nostradamus. And so they were religiously following his visions and trying to make them come true so that their plans would fall into place. Yeah. And then also they were followers of a movement called the Israel Vision, which is, again, it's a white supremacist, separatist movement, essentially.
I will get into that, but 23 convictions, 42 charges. What were they convicted for doing in terms of like the detail of the crimes now? Then so we can go to how they were organized, what they believed in, and then the whole police process to crack their activities. But what were they convicted for, and in a sense, what were the crimes about?
Karen,
okay,
can I step in there? Maybe
that would be great, Colonel. Yeah.
So the main charge was the one of high treason. And alternatively, the 42 other charges was of terrorism, sabotage, possession of firearms, possession of ammunition, possession of explosive, etc. The terrorist act that they were charged on was the old act from the apartheid era, 56 of 1954. They were eventually at the end of the trial after 10 years. all of them were found guilty on high treason. The last 5, we call them the bomber group, were also convicted on for culpable homicide for the killing of Claudia Mokone, as well as conspiracy to commit murder for the attempt of the assassination of Madiba Nelson Mandela. The sentences they were laid on was varied different sentences in the sense that as their involvement in the movement was different, the judge seen it fit to sentence them different sentences. Some of them got 35 years. Some of them got suspended sentences.
Yeah. And maybe before we go back to Karen, Colonel, I'm thinking here just a quick rundown of the actual activities, like the bombs, the assassination attempt, the collection of different ammunitions and guns and all of that. Can you just run us through the sort of evidence, but also the actual activities that they got engaged in for which they were convicted?
Thank you. You see, the group main purpose was to create a racial war in South Africa. That was their main purpose, to create a racial war in South Africa. Their following was not that big. They at one night, the 12th of September 2002, they planned and came together to move to Gauteng and to explode 18 car bombs in Gauteng, various targets there. And on the farm where they were gathering, they were expecting 500 people to pitch up. Only 27 persons pitched up. And they dispersed the next morning. So the first real crimes that they committed in the physical of explosions was the Soweto bombings. You remember there was 9 explosives on the 30th of September in Soweto, 30th of October, sorry, in Soweto, on the railway lines, also at the mosque, and there's also one failed attempt at the Buddhist temple in Bronkhorstspruit. But in the process, unfortunately, Claudia Mokone was killed by a piece of railway line that was flung into a house. Then the second bomb that they exploded was at the Grand Central Airport, where the police air wing was situated, and that they targeted the police air wing with a huge bomb, damaging 2 of our helicopters and 1 of our aircraft. Nobody was killed. And the last explosion that they physically caused was the Ntamvuma Bridge between Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, there by Port Edward, where they nearly succeeded in having that bridge completely destroyed. The last action that we foiled was on the 13th of December 2002, when they planned the major attack. They wanted to explode 4 car bombs consisting of 400 kilograms each. Now that is huge bombs. At the taxi ranks in Soweto, Alexandra, Breë Street, Marabastad, and Bloed Street in Pretoria. So that was the physical plans. But during the time, and that is where just to explain to the listeners where high treason comes in, is the conspiracy to overthrow the government of the day. And hence the conspiracy between all the groupings, all 23 of them were proven, and hence the judge was able to convict them on high treason.
And the final one relates to Madiba. And Karen has a very dramatic description about them setting up a bomb, believing that Madiba is going to be coming through the road on traveling through land, and the old man felt sick that morning and he flew in.
Thank goodness. Yeah, so Madiba was supposed to go and open a agricultural school. It's the Mandela Barloworld Agricultural School in Bolobedo, so the Dzanine area. And he was set to go and officially open it. And it was actually while the last group, the bomber group, was still on the run. And while they were at their safe house, they actually saw a small article in a newspaper just informing of Madiba officially going to open the school, and they thought, wow, this is a great opportunity.
Yeah.
And so they went and they did their recon in the area, planted a bucket bomb in a culvert, and they were literally lying in wait next to the road in the morning, until 11 o'clock in the morning, waiting for the convoy to come. And while they were lying there, they heard the choppers coming. And it's just a miracle that Madiba fell sick that day. Otherwise, it would have been a very different story.
And I mean, Colonel, when you did recover, I wonder if you did the specific bomb connections that they had planned to use on Madiba. Were they actually going to be fatal?
Yes, the connection, the bomb builder in the group, Kobus Pretorius, had practiced and tested all these detonators and all this explosion devices beforehand. So once that convoy or the car of Madiba would have crossed the culvert, a huge explosion would have taken place, and he was surely being killed. What they did is when we arrested them, I found a GPS in one of the vehicles, and on the GPS there was a waypoint Madiba of Mandela. I sent one of my members to that grid reference, and they were found in the book. There is a picture of them of him standing exactly at the culvert where the bomb was planted. So yes, they were 100% on route, and would he have traveled by vehicle that day, he would have been not with us in a few seconds.
When I read the book, you actually come into the play by some form of coincidence, and I'd like you to take us through that actually some of these men, you knew them, and you had some form of a confrontation to say, what the hell are you guys up to? You better come out clean. Just take us through that interesting coincidence that gets you one of them on a confession line.
Yes, so the background of the story is I used to be the commander of the murder and robbery unit here in the Bushveld area. I'm staying in Bella and was based in Morimole. The murder and robbery unit closed down, and I was transferred to an office job. And I'm not the guy for office job sitting behind the desk.
Yes.
And I was really at the stage of leaving the police for another job. When the call came on this Monday, the 16th of September 2002, one of my colleagues in Pretoria, Louis Bester, phoned me and asked me, please just send a guy or some of our members, a detective, to a farm in Bella. There's a problem there, and there's no detectives on the scene that knows what's going on. I didn't know also what was going on, but decided by myself, well, why do I send somebody else? I would rather drive there myself, and at least I get out of the office.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was a second a decision taken in a second that had that lasting outcome for the rest of my life. So I went to the farm for Herman van Rooyen in just out of Bella, and then the book tells us what exactly happened there. But during my time on the farm and then looking at what was found there, I could make my own deductions and saw that something was not right here. Herman van Rooyen, I know him personally very well. He was the commander of the local commandos reaction force, and he worked with my unit various farm attacks and cash and transit robberies with his commando reaction force. So I know him very well. And the moment when I drove away from the farm that afternoon, I was thinking, if Van Rooyen was involved in something sinister, his sidekick can only be Blackie Swart, a person that I also know very, very well for many years.
Yes.
And on my way back to town through the farm roads, I drove past Blackie Swart's farm, and I said, let's turn in here and see what he's got to say. Not knowing anything. Knocked on the door. Usually a farmhouse, here in the bushveld, the front door is open. You can just walk in and even walk down to the kitchen and pour yourself a cup of coffee, and then start looking for the people. His farmhouse's front door was locked. I knocked on it. He opened the door. Was very, very surprised to see me, but also I could see the fear in his eyes. And my only words to him is, "What did you and Van Rooyen do? You must come and you must talk to me, otherwise you're not going to be locked up." And in the book I read 2 days later, he phoned me and he spilled the beans of the planned attack of the 13th of September 2002, when they wanted to explode the 18 car bombs in Gauteng.
And they had gotten them from AVs, it seems.
Yeah, they planned they built the bombs, physical bombs. It was in containers, pipes. There's photos available. You saw the photos in the book, and they rented vehicles at Avis in Ouer Tambo and another place to put the pipe bombs inside it, and park the Avis vehicles in front of the targets. Not very cleverly. The same Blackie Swart was with a guy called, excuse number 14, Davie Oosthuizen. They rented the vehicles from Avis, paying with Davie Oosthuizen's credit card. And all of the drivers that was there to collect the vehicles produced their real driver's licenses. So all the evidence was just laying up. I just had to pick it up there. So we were not very clever in doing that, taking that action, yes.
And most of these men were educated. I mean, the sort of ringleader that Karen opens the book with even had a post-university qualification. But these were not just like simple men. They were not just have had some form of security training, but they lived lives that were or can be considered as professional lives, some of them. Karen?
Yes, absolutely. So, sorry, Mbuyiseni. Yes.
Yeah.
So, Mike du Toit, the ringleader, he was actually a university lecturer at the time at Mamelodi's Vista University, and he had an archaeology degree. And he, after serving his time in prison, he now has a PhD degree as well. And then several of the others were medical doctors. Auditors. I mean, there's definitely a lot of professionals within that group.
So it's not just a bunch of poor people bitten by the world who are begging somewhere and therefore decide they're going to take this course into their hands. These are sophisticated men who, on the face of it, you cannot actually relate them to extremism. Would that be a sufficient judgment, Colonel?
That is exactly so. They are not the old AW brandy and coke type of right wing persons they get their courage by drinking
with khaki pants, short pants, and
they did wear khaki pants and short pants, but they did not. Actually, they were so religious in the religion that Karen explained to you. That you can classify them into radical religion. They didn't use alcohol at all. Some of them did not even eat pork. But the main thing that they were the common denominator between them is their strong beliefs in the visions of the Sina van Rensburg, Prophet of God books, and the predictions that they absolutely saw it as something that must happen, that is true. And when it didn't happen, they wanted to cause it. They wanted to cause the racial
prophecy,
war. The prophecy. They wanted to fulfill it without. And a prophecy is not something that you can trigger. It must happen on the time, whenever it's decided to, or when it's considered to be happening.
When we come back from the headlines, I do now want Karen to take us through the actual motivations, the formation, the ideology, this Rensburg character of the 19th century, actually. What were the actual beliefs and the basic things that they were looking forward to happen, and what were the signs they were reading as the time for the prophecy to be fulfilled, which included this Zimbabwe situation and explosion around the early 2000s. But I want to go through the headlines with Nhlanhla Sihume. We'll be back. If you've just joined us, Bantwana Benkosi, we are discussing the High Treason Club, the Boere Magoe trial book by Karen Mitchell. It's time for the headlines. Stay tuned. We'll get back to the conversation.
Stay informed. Power Talk with Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, 9 a.m. to midday on Power 98.7.
If you want to join these conversations, rate 619-87-000. We are discussing the book, The High Treason Club, the Boere Magoe on trial. I'm with the author, Karen Mitchell, and Colonel Tholi Vreugdenburg. Oh, God. Forgive me. Lovely. Now, Mitchell, maybe you take us through how these, at least in the beginning, the key minds, what were their problems with the new South Africa that make them turn to this prophet and ideological revival?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Mbuyiseni, what you need to keep in mind is this is early 2000s. This is 2001.
Yes.
And if you look at the context of it all, this was 6-7 years post-apartheid. So you've got a white population who's suddenly trying to figure out their identity. Where do they belong in the country? Because they've always been the beneficiaries, and now all of a sudden there's a lot of changes. So you've got a few there. It was like-minded individuals, but a small group at first. And so they started finding resonance in Sina van Rensburg's visions, thinking, okay, but he's saying that the Vierkleur shall weer wapper, so the Boer republics will be reinstated. So for them, they're grasping onto any sense of hope at that stage. And what they are doing is they are holding small meetings across the country with probably about 6-7 people together, like-minded individuals. And the people are worried. They're concerned about the land expropriation in Zimbabwe, and also seeing what is happening in Zimbabwe. So obviously the already existing fears are growing. And then also in the early 2000s, there was a snowball of strikes. But what we know 20 years later is that it's strike season. We've all become used to it, but at that stage it was very new and they were concerned. So they thought, okay, we need to do something here. And just for the listeners, so I interviewed accused number 1, Mike du Toit, in prison over several years, probably 4-5 years. And every time when I asked him, so why did you plan this? You are considered the leader. And his answer was always, it was a defensive strategy. It was not an offensive. But when you look at the documents that was recovered by the authorities on Mike's laptop, this is called document 12, which is very much an offensive plan. It explains how they were going to take over the military bases, an exact plan of what they were going to do to take control of the country. But then also, so how the movement grew is they were having these small meetings and then also seeking like-minded individuals as part of their recruitment strategy. So where it was in the, it was a good breeding ground for people who were of like-minded. And then also specifically people who were followers of the Israel vision. Now, the Israel vision is inherently, it is a separatist vision. It is white people believing they are part of the lost tribes of Israel. They are God's chosen people. They are superior to any other race. And so that is such a big part of what the Boeramag was when you listen to them and talk to them, they say, oh, but we have no problem with people of other races. But when you break it down, they think they are better than all other races. And yeah, that was basically the big things. So then they started having meetings and invited people to come to meetings where there was a video shown of Siener van Rensburg's prophecies. And all of the people who attended the meetings, they filled out an attendance register that was there. And what they did not know was that their names were being added to document 12. They were essentially being signed up as members of the Boeramag without their knowledge. So Tolly has often said that when he interviewed the people afterwards whose names were on those registers, they said, listen, we went to about 2 or 3 meetings and then decided this is definitely not something we want to be part of. But for the Boeramag leadership, they saw these people as numbers and they were convinced that they could succeed with their plans.
What strikes me as well are the big concerns. I mean, there is an event, I think, where Mike or some of the key ringleaders was part of about 1,000 farmers who went to stop a land occupation. And this is one of the things that had come out as a big concern for them. The idea that, one, the police were no longer attending to the farms in the same way that they were before. They were no longer even giving budget to the commandos, and the farmer tax were increasing. But also they were worried about land occupation by black communities on their various farms, but also restitution, land claims. Can you take us through that, Michelle?
Saying what I'm going to do here is I'm definitely going to divert you to Tolly Vreugdenburg on this, since he was actually very much involved with farmer tax at that stage. So he will definitely be able to give much more information on this point. Okay,
Colonel?
Yes, so the incident you're referring to, Lawrence du Plessis, was it was at Ventersdorp, where there was a invasion of the land, and then the right wing or the farmers tried to take the law in their own hands, and the police, there was a shooting take place, and Lawrence was injured. And that is the thing that changed him. He later became a state witness. But going back to the perception that the leaders of the Boeramag wanted to create at the meetings was that, listen, farmer tax is going out of hand. Farmer tax is a way of genocide, as it even the narrative is pushed today. But remember, I told you I was commander of the murder robbery unit before I got involved in this one here in the Bushveld, and our main purpose or our main crime that we investigated in the Bushveld was farmer tax, farm murders, and Wolf Herman van Rooyen and his commando system, as well as all the other commando systems in the Bushveld area, from Platjan border post to Daraport border post to Marble Hall area. It's a huge area that we covered. We had a 95% solving rate, 100% conviction rate on farmer tax. So we were very successful in countering farmer tax. So by so that we even went on a road show with one of the South African singers that is in the was in the police. Frana Benari, his son is now a very well-known singer. Addressing the farmers female unions and telling them about what to do to protect themselves. So yes, the farmer tax was only a narrative they wanted to push down and use it as a recruiting tool. The land expropriation and all that, it is still the same in 2002 as today. Nothing has taken place. So that is always the media and the people that wanted to use it as an excuse for committing violence, and that is also that they used during that time.
So, Karen, tell us about this waiting period for the trial. You put it at around close to a decade, and essentially what happens to their lives. There is a section in your book which I find interesting, and I'm just going to, for the sake of everyone, how all of us, Mike, who was in your determination, the ringleader, and speaks about his time in prison. And he says, when I first arrived in the cell, the correctional officer introduced me as Mike du Toit, the Boer who wanted to overthrow the ANC government. The police had probably instructed the correctional officer to introduce me as such, so that the black prisoners would want to attack me. However, the opposite happened, and it turned out they seemed to be afraid of me. When I grew a beard, they avoided me even further. One day I asked a fellow black cellmate why the black people did not want to attack me, and he replied it was because I had a beard, because I was a Boer, and because they were afraid of me. The cleaner eventually cleared an entire corner of the cell just for me. The closest beds were placed about 2 meters away from mine, and the cleaner draped sheets over my bed to give me privacy. Phenomenal. Even when they arrived in prison, the rest of the prisoners were scared of them. But just take me through. They await in a trial for about 10 years. They are not even having a difficulty in prison.
Yes, absolutely. So they were in prison. So Mike was arrested around April of 2002, and the final sentencing was at the end of 2013. So it was about 10, 11 years in prison as awaiting trial prisoners. But it's also, when you look at the length of this trial, at the start of it, when Colonel Tolly Vreugdenburg was asked to be on the case or on the trial, everybody expected it to take about 3 years.
Yes.
Now, you need to take into consideration that there were 23 accused, which is a mammoth amount of people to see in an accused dock. It's quite an intimidating sight. But so for 10 years, they were awaiting trial prisoners, but much of it was their own doing, because there were so many applications brought for very silly things, like there was a family, the Pretorius family, and they brought applications in because there were radios in the prison that were playing around the clock, apparently, and they complained that they couldn't sleep. So they brought an application to the court for people's radios to be switched off. And it was just these constant applications that would stretch everything out. And they were also, you need to take into consideration, sometimes some of the people get ill or they get sick and they cannot attend the court hearing. So if they are in any way mentioned during that day's court hearing, the trial needs to be postponed yet again. So there were so many postponements. But yes, when you look at the 10 years that they had in prison, they were studying. Some of them had access, or most of them had access to laptops. And yes, I do think they were treated relatively well. And as you just mentioned, there was respect for them in prison, and just the irony of them not seeing black people as their equal, and yet they are being respected.
With the state, Colonel, of crime intelligence today, I mean, at the time, the crime intelligence was so central to tracking down, including even a proper counterintelligence operation that infiltrated them with a character called JC, who had been part of the AWV before. And I just want to ask, I mean, you see what General Mkhwanazi has said, General Masemula has said, with the state of crime intelligence in South Africa today. A job like you carried out together with crime intelligence operatives of the time. If something like this is happening today, do you think the police would uncover it in the same way you guys did in the early 2000s?
You must just put it into the time frame. During that time frame, you must remember Jackie Selebe was the commissioner of the police. Between him and I butted heads every day that we saw each other. You also in the book you read about the struggles I had with crime.
Yes.
Lack of cooperation until we managed to work together with each other and we start working. But very important is during this time we created a structure in South Africa looking at the security of South Africa in the sense of terrorism, where I think the book is also speaks about the Counter-Terrorism Functional Committee, where all of the state involvement, all of the role players' involvement, and that structure is in place. So it is not only depending on crime intelligence. There's other intelligence structures also in place within that. And I believe, although I've been on retirement now for 2 years, I believe that they will still be able to, and I hope, and I pray, that they will still be able to counter something like this. Remember, this is not the only one that during since 2000. 2012, there was the Mangaung fault attack that we also addressed. In 2019, there was the Crusaders, Rick Nissen, that we also addressed, and we prevented, in all those cases, mass bloodshed, used bloodshed in South Africa by the cooperation between the detectives. That was my job, and the crime intelligence and the rest of the intelligence world in South Africa.
Karen, taking into consideration the ideological motivations, this sort of fear of white genocide, it seems to me is much larger than it was in the early 2000s, in a sense that now it is affirmed by Donald Trump. It's affirmed by the most powerful president or most powerful man with the biggest military power in the world, on the one hand. And on the other, there is also this sense of uncertainty amongst many white people still relating to their identity. How do you rate all of these things? That's my first question. The second question is, do you think the commandos were totally disbanded? Do you think it's possible that they may have just retreated to underground and just functioning better now that they can be uncovered?
Shall I start with the latter question?
Yes.
The commandos were an official structure that was part of the Defence Force, National Defence Force, National SANDF, and it was officially disbanded. All the officers were closed. All the equipment was removed from their possession. Everything was taken away. They were supposed to amalgamate with the South African Police Reservists, but since my start in the police in 1980, there was always an animosity between the police and the army. So they didn't want to merge with the police reservists, and they completely stopped being part of the official security system in the policing areas. It is so that most of them, or some of them, I won't say most of them, some of them joined the right-wing resistance organizations and are still part of that right-wing resistance organization currently in South Africa. So no, the commandos didn't go underground. They were completely disbanded. And the Boeramag was the last straw that broke the camel's back for the commandos. because that's the huge involvement of the commandos in this Boerenmag case. I think the first question, maybe Karen can...
Yes, Karen?
Perfect. Okay, so we were speaking about white people's fear and genocide. So I think obviously after what transpired earlier this year with Donald Trump's executive order, when I saw it that morning, my jaw literally hit the floor. And I think we can all of us can say there is no white genocide. And I think it's been proven, although a lot of white people would not agree. But also something that you can use just for this debate is one of the Boerenmag accused, Kobus Pretorius. So he was one of three sons and a father who were on trial. And Kobus actually distanced himself from the family formally in court. And he told, for mitigation of sentence, he explained how he had been raised and just how he likened it to his parents raping his mind. And that is such a deep thing to look at, and it brings you back to the point of a child will think what their parents tell them to think. And so for as long as white people in South Africa are being told that they are better than somebody else or that there is a fear, then that fear will continue. That is how they were raised. But then also just with the Afrikaners and the Afrikaner refugees, if they genuinely had a fear, I can't tell them, who am I to tell them that you cannot be afraid of something? So that's also, we all need to respect each other just for being who we are. That's what it all comes down to. But I think it's totally unfounded to say that white people need to be afraid of a genocide.
But Van Rensburg, I hope I'm pronouncing it properly,
Yes, that's
are
perfect.
there still people conversant with the literature, with the figure of Van Rensburg? I saw AfriForum erecting a statue of Paul Kruger the other day. Figures like Van Rensburg, are they still popular in the Afrikaner community?
Oh, absolutely. It's quite scary and interesting if you just go on TikTok even and you type in Siener van Rensburg, there are massive debates about Siener van Rensburg, and people have podcasts and they will have long conversations about Siener van Rensburg. Now, I don't know whether you've ever gone and tried to read one of his visions, but it makes no sense. So it's one of those things, if you go and read it and you want to find a certain interpretation in it, you will twist those words until you see what you want to see.
Yeah. Well, Bantwana Benkosi, if you want to read about all of this, the High Treason Club, the Boerenmag on Trial by Karen Michel, it is still in the bookshelves. It's published this year. I came across it when I went to buy some other things there at Exclusive Books. But if you want to read about these characters and about how the Boerenmag came to be, how they operated, and how they were finally disorganized, arrested, and taken to jail by the police, that's your book. Karen Michel and Colonel Dolly Vreugenberg. Dankie to both of you for creating time to speak to us this morning.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Mbuyiseni. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Colonel.
It's only our pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you.
Dankie. Let's go to the headlines, Bantwana Benkosi. After that, we're going to take you to the press conference where the Premier of Limpopo will be addressing the fatal accident that occurred on the N1 where the death toll is standing at 43 people, I am told, before we go to General Sibiya's appearance in Parliament. Let's take the news with Ntate Sihumi.